Hello again, students. Today we're going to examine the home front during World War II, meaning what was going on back in the United States while the war was raging in the Pacific, Africa, and Europe. And we're going to especially look at how the war is going to affect life for people living in the U.S. You would be hard-pressed to find anybody who was opposed to the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the nation's economy and military rapidly mobilized in response to the Japanese attack. 16 million American men total will serve in the war. 40% of them were volunteers, 60% of them were draftees. This will more than double the size of the American Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. Among them are 300,000 Mexican Americans and 25,000 Native Americans who served in integrated units. The Army had integrated them with white soldiers, as well as 1 million African American men who served in segregated units. So African Americans were still being segregated into separate units and oftentimes relegated to non-combat roles. They had to fight with the Army to get them to put them into combat roles. And as need required towards the end of the war, more and more black units were put into combat, including the famous Red Tails, fighter pilots who escorted American bombers. Also notable is the service of Japanese Americans. As we'll see in a little bit, Japanese Americans were pretty harshly treated by the United States government, but many of them did volunteer and serve despite the fact that they were being widely distrusted. In the 442nd Combat Unit, which was mostly Japanese American men, is the most decorated combat unit from World War II. 350,000 American women served in the military in such units as the Women's Army Corps. They oftentimes were in support roles, clerical work, nurses, truck drivers, cargo pilots, and the like. The U.S. government is going to, much like they did in the First World War, pass regulations controlling the economy. The Office of War Management will oversee and allocate resources and regulate the production of things like these bombers that we see here being produced in an American factory. The Office of the Price Administration will set minimum wages and maximum prices, much like we had seen during World War I. And there will be very famously rationing books established during this time to conserve resources for the war and to limit the amount of things that Americans could buy. Massive government spending on this scale is going to bring an end to the Great Depression. Unemployment will fall from 19% in 1938 to about 1.2% in 1944, almost non-existent. U.S. production was amazing. It was double the United States alone's production was double all of the Axis powers combined. To pay for this, the government is going to sell war bonds, much like it did in World War I, and also do a general 5% income tax increase on all working Americans. And the national debt will balloon during this time from $42 billion to $269 billion, larger than all previous debts combined. One of the great success stories of the home front during World War II was the willingness of Americans to sacrifice and pitch in together to support the war effort in any way that they could. Because of rationing, resources were scarce. So many Americans carpooled or planted victory gardens, home gardening, to grow their own vegetables so that they weren't taking from them. You can see this picture here of a poster to promote canning by the United States government, for people to promote canning and to preserve their own vegetables and fruits at home rather than ones that would be shipped overseas to the Allies and American soldiers. Many people took new jobs, worked overtime to help produce more war material, volunteered for the Red Cross, doing things like manning blood banks, making rolling bandages, making care packages for soldiers. People collected things like scrap metal, paper, and cooking oil in scrap drives to try and melt down and be recycled and used by the military for the war effort. Labor unions worked with the government to avoid going on strike. Hollywood made movies promoting the American cause during the war. One of the most famous is the WWII series from Frank Capra. And movie stars and musicians, usually through the USO, the United Services Organization, volunteered their time to entertain the troops and keep up morale. Can you imagine such a spirit of cooperation and sacrifice today when Americans are divided over whether or not they should be expected to wear a small piece of cloth over their face to protect one another from a global pandemic? Makes you yearn a little bit for the past. On the other hand, we go from one of the brightest spots in the home front to one of the darkest, and that is the treatment of Japanese Americans who were widely distrusted. And some of this treatment will at first be directed towards all people descended from Axis nations, Italian and German Americans included, but very, very quickly they give up on suspicion of those people. But Japanese Americans, however, will remain suspect throughout the war. Most notably, the United States government, President Franklin Roosevelt will issue Executive Order 9066, which requires the removal of Japanese Americans from their homes in the West Coast, primarily California, to internment camps, originally called concentration camps, in the interior. Over 100,000 native-born and immigrant Japanese were relocated during this time. Many had to sell off their possessions for whatever they could get for them or expect them to be gone. Sometimes there would be stories about them putting them into the trust of a neighbor who would then sell it off while they were gone, or people would ransack their homes and shops while they were interred and steal from them. These camps were placed in remote areas of places like Idaho and Arizona because those states did not want Japanese Americans to be relocated to their states as free citizens. So they had to put them in these prison camps that we see in this picture here. They suffered from food shortages and insubstantial medical care in these camps. And they generally tried to do their best to make do with it. Many of the men who were in these camps, young men, volunteered to serve in the military as sort of a way of proving their loyalty and hoping to bring an end to this. Daniel Inouye would be an example of this as well. These clearly could be considered challenges to human rights, and they were challenged in the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court upheld them as constitutional in cases such as Korematsu v. United States. But in 1988, the United States government officially apologized to the Japanese Americans for the internment and paid $20,000 in reparations to every surviving internee. As is typical, war provided economic and job opportunities for people who had been denied them in the past, particularly women and minorities. The government actually encouraged women to work in the war industries, and by the end of the war, a full third of the workforce was made up of women. This is not unusual. Many women had been working in the workforce prior to this, particularly in white-collar positions, but what was different was the involvement of women in heavy industries, like we see these women here who are all welders, as well as breaking with the tradition of married women working outside of the home. Typically, a woman who worked outside the home would oftentimes quit her job when she got married, but this is going to sort of break with that tradition, and many women will remain in these jobs after the war is over, particularly in these white-collar industries. They were, however, still paid less than men, as is typical today. 2 million African Americans will be able to find jobs in the defense force, defense industries, even though they were still facing discrimination from their bosses and co-workers during this. African American leaders started what was called the WWII campaign, which is sort of the beginning of the civil rights movement from the 50s and 60s. The 2V stood for victory, fighting fascism abroad and fighting racism at home. A. Philip Randolph, one of the more notable African American leaders at this time, planned a march on Washington for an end to segregation and for job opportunities, much like King's that would come later. And in order to avoid this, Franklin Roosevelt will be pressured to issue Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in hiring in any company that did business with the government during the war, which is going to be most of them. Much like we saw again with the First World War, as well as during the Great Depression of the 1930s, this will be a time of a lot of migration, a lot of movement by the American people, particularly to the cities in the north, and especially California. We'll see its population dramatically increase during this time. Government spending on military bases and industries in the south, which Roosevelt particularly targeted them because of how poor the Southeast was compared to the rest of the country, is going to invigorate its economy and attract people there. They actually increased their population by about 1 million, although the rural population, both north and south, will decline over the time. And this is what's going to lead to the issuing of the Bracero program, which is a program from the United States government where they encouraged Mexican immigration to the U.S. To fill the farm work and the jobs that were sort of left empty by all the people moving to the cities to go to work in war industries or work near the military bases and naval bases on the coast. Native Americans, many of them moved off of the reservations for these same opportunities or to enlist in the military, and few of them, many, did not return to the reservations after this. This migration does lead to racial tensions, once again, as we had seen with World War I and the Red Summer that came afterwards. During the war, there are several race riots. Some of the more notable ones in Detroit, 34 people were killed, and federal troops had to be called in to quell the riots. And most notably in this picture, we see here the aftermath of the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles. American sailors went on something of a rampage, roaming the Mexican-American sections of Los Angeles, looking for young men wearing zoot suits, which is a style of the time, which the sailors considered to be a waste of cloth. It was largely a targeted racial attack, not so much about the waste of cloth. As you can see, these young men here have been stripped of their suits, and that is why. When police were called in, as we see the gentleman on the left there, they mostly arrested the Mexican Americans and left the U.S. sailors go. Taking a look at the graphic organizer for this one, it's a web. From the middle there, we're looking at the home front, and each of the first spokes to come out of it is a statement about the United States home front during the war. And what I ask of you is to supply 2 pieces of evidence that will support this statement. Some of them have many different pieces of evidence in the outline, so pick the 2 you find most compelling. So as an example, if we focus in here on American mobilization during the war, I mentioned the 16 million Americans who served in the military during the war. I leave the rest for you to find. I love you. Bye-bye.